please.
Okay. Well, it's wonderful to see all you friends around the world. This webinar originated in a conversation I had a few months back with my co-moderator, Ameth, who you can see on the screen. And Ameth was commenting on the fact that...
No, John, sorry, I must interrupt you.
Can you guys hear John? I can't.
Did you send me the link?
I just can't handle it.
Send me the link.
I just can't handle it.
So somebody's speaker is on, possibly in John's place, and that's why you're getting the feedback. So if they could turn off the speakers.
John, Paul is saying that if you can turn off, there seems to be a second set of speakers in your room. So if you can turn that off, that would be the best.
It's probably Suzanne's speaker. I think it's because the two of you are in the same room. John, you're now muted.
John, if you, can you please either speak or hand over to whoever's going to speak?
Yeah, we are live on YouTube, so...
yeah, we are live on YouTube now. And you are muted. You are muted, John. Maybe Amenophis can take over and chair the meeting.
Okay. All right. Okay, thank you everyone for being with us today. And my name is Ameth, also known as Amenophis. I'm a member of GRILA, the Group for Research and Initiatives for the Liberation of Africa. And we've been discussing this issue with John a couple of times ago. And then today we're gonna have this event to really look at the current relationship between Africa and China, trying to analyze the current state of this relationship, the challenges and the perspective. People who would like to have more information about GRILA can go to our website. It's GRILA.org. So thanks for the Manifesto Group for inviting us to be a co-chair of this event. I'm going to make a quick introduction, and then we have a set of speakers who will each be speaking for about 10 minutes because we have 6 or 7 speakers. And at the end of the presentation, we're going to have a question and answer period where we can interact with the rest of the public. This year marked the 66th anniversary of the Bandung Conference, which took place in Indonesia and brought together third world nations from Asia and Africa. They gathered in Bandung to promote economic and cultural cooperation and to oppose colonialism. That conference led to the creation of the non-aligned movement, which re-emphasized and elaborated on the importance of economic cooperation between countries of the global south, mainly Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So today, 66 years later, the global world order is still very counterproductive and toxic for societies that are on the periphery of the capitalist system. And it is even more so for African countries. Africa is still restricted to the role of provider of raw materials and natural resources for a rapacious, predatory capitalist system whose model of consumption poses critical challenges to the world ecosystem and in general to the survival of the planet as well, because of dramatic climatic changes. It is within this context that all major world players have Africa at the center of their strategy of growth for decades to come. The exploitative relationship of all imperialist powers, Europe, North America mainly, started with the transatlantic enslavement and continued through colonialism. From the forced unpaid labor of millions of Africans over 4 centuries, Western capitalism reaped unparalleled profits that in turn became the foundation of a capitalist system of accumulation, which continues until our day. Today, new actors are trying to get their share of the African pie and challenging the persistent monopoly of Western imperialist countries over African resources. China, of course, is a key actor in this new search for resources, which only Africa can provide if the model of predatory consumerism continues to prevail in the countries at the center of the capitalist system. Now, will China's increasing involvement in Africa be a game changer or a continuity to the old asymmetrical relationship that have prevailed between Africa and the West? That is a question. What should be the strategy for Africa and its diaspora to regain its sovereignty through a self-reliant approach of development in all aspects of life: economic, political, social, cultural, intellectual, or scientific? For Africa, what are the implications for internal obstacles and also external dynamics of world politics, which are preventing a move towards a strong and unified African bloc capable of defending its interests vis-à-vis any other nation or a bloc of countries? Today, other new actors such as Russia, Turkey, India, Canada are all moving aggressively in an accelerated process of resource grabbing. To make this possible, a web of military bases is being set up by these powers across the continent, aimed at securing economic presence in the continent through an unprecedented process of militarization. Africans are still recovering from a long period of lost sovereignty, trying to find their ways in building a compact bloc that can be a key actor in a multipolar world, to be able to deal on an equal footing with any other bloc, whether it is Europe, North America, China, Russia, India, or anyone else. In this context, we will try to critically assess the current relationship between Africa and China by evaluating its strength, but also the weaknesses, separate the ideological propaganda, which is most likely emanating from the West propaganda machinery that is trying to portray this relationship as neo-imperialist, from the realities on the ground, which nonetheless present some real challenges in some areas. However, there are also opportunities and risks to be managed for the benefits of both Africa and China. Inside Africa, especially among younger activists and within some political movements, a debate is raging as to what is this relationship ought to be. How can Africa create conditions for correcting the asymmetrical relationship that have prevailed between herself and the rest of the world for the last couple of centuries. This question is key if we are to create mutually beneficial relationship, a prerequisite for building a multipolar world where Africa is no longer the pie to be shared, but a key actor capable of defending her interests, as is done by any other countries in the world. And it must also be addressed for Africa to be engaged in moving the world in the direction more sustainable for the survival of humanity, a world which is based on social justice, through international solidarity, and fair cooperation between all countries of the world. That's why GRILA Toronto and GRILA in general is happy to have been invited to chair this panel discussion and to explore, without being xenophile or xenophobe, all the dimensions of the current relationship between China and Africa, and to draw upon perspective able to move us closer to an optimal relationship that respects the interests of both parties. So that's the quick introduction I wanted to make just to start. And then we're gonna go through the list of panelists. Every panelist will have maximum of 10 minutes to do the presentation. We're gonna try to be disciplined in terms of the timing because of the time constraints. And then today we're gonna start the presenters with Danny Haifong, which I'm gonna introduce very quickly, who is a socialist activist, a writer, a political analyst. For the last 5 years, Haifong has been a weekly contributor to Black Agenda Report. His article also appeared in publications such as Mint Press News, Counterpunch, the American Herald Tribune, the Center for Global Research in Canada, the Herald in Zimbabwe. Haifong has frequently appeared on Black Agenda Radio, CPR News with Don Deba, the Taylor Report, RT, and Sputnik International. So I will let Danny start his presentation, and a reminder to everyone to be muted when they are not speaking. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for everyone who is attending, and to, of course, the International Manifesto Group and all of the participants for putting this together. So, friends and comrades, the China-Africa relationship is one of historic importance, and this relationship has been slandered repeatedly by the Western media. China is always at the center of the slander, with partner nations in Africa treated as worse than an afterthought. A colonial attitude on the part of the West and its ringleader, the United States, remains a dominant trend in geopolitics. Still, history marches forward, and the growing partnership between China and Africa is a clear sign of an emerging multipolar world. It is for this reason that the West is so concerned about China's relationship with African countries. The Western world is in economic and political turmoil. COVID-19, climate change, political instability, and economic crisis has placed a spotlight on imperialist-driven global inequality. A crisis of legitimacy has ensued, which is most acute in the United States. The US capitalist economy has shrunk enormously as a proportion of total world GDP, and its political system is racked with incompetence. Military force has become the US's primary means of relating to the world, and this is especially true on the African continent, where the US possesses military partnerships with all but one African country via AFRICOM. The US reliance on military force in Africa comes in response to China's growing role on the continent. Military force is always packaged with propaganda. The denigration of China's cooperation with African nations helps mask an important reality. US and European corporation and financial lenders have lost the capacity to compete with China in Africa and the rest of the global South, for that matter. China's overall trade volume with African nations amounts to roughly $200 billion per year, a number 5 times larger than the value of US trade with African countries. China's partnership with Africa is a daily reminder that the centuries-old colonial order is in a state of decay. To conceal this trend, Western propagandists have spread rumors and falsehoods about the character of China's partnership with Africa. The term, quote unquote, debt trap diplomacy has circulated hundreds, if not thousands of times in the Western media to describe China's supposedly nefarious use of debt as a means of political coercion. No evidence of the so-called debt trap is ever presented, and Western analysts have been caught making up examples out of whole cloth. The most recent lie spread by the West was that China had seized a Ugandan airport due to non-payment of the loans required to develop the ongoing project. Before this, Western media claimed that China was threatening to seize a port in Djibouti for the same reason. None of this has come to pass. The reality of the China-Africa relationship is actually much different than the steady dose of fear that we are fed by the Western imperial powers. Flexibility and solidarity are hallmarks of China's bilateral ties with African countries. In 2018, for example, China allowed Ethiopia to defer interest payments on the construction of a railway connecting the country to Djibouti. The term of the loan was extended by 15 years. China possesses similar debt relief agreements with 19 other African nations. It would be mistaken, however, to view China's cooperation with Africa as simply a matter of dollars and cents. Infrastructure development and solidarity against COVID-19 form the foundation of China-Africa cooperation. China's Huawei Corporation provides 70% of Africa's 4G technology and is the first to offer 5G to African countries. China has built more than 13,000 kilometers of roads and rails, as well as more than 80 large-scale power facilities, with dozens of projects already underway to assist Africa's transition to renewable energy, known as the continent's Great Green Wall. China has provided close to 200 million COVID-19 vaccines to African nations to date and has pledged another 1 billion at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, held late last month. The West, led by the United States, has dismissed these accomplishments by defaming China as the equivalent of Western colonial powers of yore, and Africa as having no destiny or agency to speak of. White supremacy continues to dominate the geopolitics of American empire and its Western allies. Dehumanization and slander are all that the world's imperialist hegemons have left at their disposal to conceal the benefits of a multipolar world. Multipolarity is a cornerstone of China-Africa cooperation and the broader Belt and Road Initiative spearheaded by China. Global trade networks that treat nations with common histories of colonial subjugation as equals are, in fact, a direct threat to modern-day Western imperialism. Western imperialism cannot compete with China without completely undermining the exploitation and oppression at the heart of its system. That's because when it comes to Western imperialism in Africa, the past is the present. Western countries carved up Africa in the 19th century only to punish the continent's just struggle for independence with coups, military interventions, and neoliberal, neocolonial economic arrangements. France, for example, continues to control the monetary systems of more than a dozen of its former colonies. Belgium punished Congo's independence movement, led by the assassinated Patrice Lumumba, through the imposition of an enormous debt to be repaid to the former colonizer. Multinational corporations residing in the West have played a leading role in ensuring that more than $40 billion annually is extracted from the continent each year. China's model of development stands in stark contrast to the West's neocolonial arrangements. Instead of extraction, China offers infrastructure. Instead of exploitation, China offers cooperation. Instead of military expansionism, China offers solidarity in the fight against poverty and climate change. The West distorts the China-Africa relationship because its model of imperialist domination has become a ball and chain on human progress and development itself. There is a saying in the West that, quote, talk is cheap. The West's distortion of the China-Africa relationship is indeed a cheap attempt to justify its ongoing imperialist hegemony that comes at an enormous cost to humanity. The longer that the West is able to slander the China-Africa relationship without a significant domestic challenge, the more difficult the achievement of the urgent tasks confronting humanity becomes. These tasks are clear: to defend self-determination, the sovereign right of development, to continue the long march toward peace, and to develop bonds of solidarity capable of liberating humanity from all vestiges of colonialism. It is therefore in the interests of peace-loving people and nations everywhere to oppose the West's distortions of the China-Africa relationship, and to do so without hesitation. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for inviting me to this great panel.
Thank you, Daniel, for your presentation. Thank you so much and for being with us. We're going to move straight to the next presenter, Huang Chang, who is an associate of Chinese Academy for Social Sciences, a writer on China-Africa relations, and the author of a book called Chinese Studies in Africa. You have 10 minutes or so to make a presentation.
Okay, well, thank you, Professor John Riddell, for inviting me to this panel. My topic today is about materials, perspectives, and methods about Chinese studies in Africa. On the basis of the traditional China-Africa relationship, China-Africa relations have developed rapidly in the past 20 years. A large number of Chinese research centers have been established in Africa to start concrete empirical research related to China. As Sarah Van Hoymissen, the director of China Studies in Botswana, said, Chinese studies in Africa is an area with a special mission and research topics. China has attracted close attention from Africa in all aspects, but at present, international research on overseas sinology is mainly concentrated in European countries and America, and as well as some other Asian countries. There are also some discussions on overseas sinology studies in Latin American countries in recent years, but the attention on African Chinese studies is very weak. To this end, I will try to sort out the important works, important arguments, and theoretical methods used of Chinese studies in the African community, so as to provide a reference for overseas Chinese science research. First of all, I would like to introduce some major research institutions of Africa. Since the 21st century, the academic research on China has had an integrated development with the expansion of the scope of Chinese research studies and improvement of research level. The Chinese research institutions in Africa mainly include think tanks, universities, scientific research institutions. Major countries include South Africa, Nigeria, Tanzania, Sudan, Botswana, etc. South Africa is the earliest African country to conduct Chinese research. In 2004, the Center for Chinese Studies University of Stellenbosch was established in South Africa to promote the exchange of knowledge, ideas, and experience between China and Africa. In addition to publishing regular journals, research reports, and policy briefings, and hold international seminars on China, the center also established a postdoctoral program in 2016 to train experts on Chinese studies. On June 2013, the Magumbue Institute for Strategic Reflection set up Chinese Civilization Research Project. This is the first African perspective of Chinese research project, assembled African think tank, politicians, scholars, and took many years of the philosophy of Chinese civilization, includes the Chinese civilization, values, politics, economy, China-Africa relations, and for South Africa, a comprehensive ending of the Communist Party of China and various policy laid for the foundation. The University of Johannesburg, the China-Africa Studies, was established on 2018, take China-Africa relations and Belt and Road Initiative as a key research project. David Moye, director of the center, is committed to China's Belt and Road Initiative. And Nigeria is the earliest West African countries of Chinese research. In 2015, the Center for China Studies of Nigeria was established, aims to, through the study of Nigeria relations, China-Africa relations, deepen various forms of exchange between the two countries. And the Communist Party history is one of its key research projects. The center gives full play to the role of Nigeria think tank, pay close attention to China's political system reform, China's reform and opening up, China's development. And the Center for University of Dar es Salaam of the University Tanzania, the first professional academic institution to study China issues and China-Africa relations in East Africa, was established in 2018. And there are so many other countries establishing China's study centers. Because of the time is limited, I will just go on the next part, the issues and trends of China studies in Africa. The first of all, the hot topic is history of China-Africa relations based on archaeology and history. The study of history of China relations is an important part of African China studies. African scholars are committed to exploring the ancient connection between China and Africa from the perspective of archaeology and history, which strongly refutes the so-called European and American public opinion, and some scholars who regarded China to Africa as a new invasion or new inroads. This is the first, and the second is a research on contemporary China-Africa shifts. China-Africa relations has been more fruitful. There are some many other articles. The next is from the observation of China to the participation in Africa, the study of Communist Party history. After the 2060s, most countries in Africa went through the process of national independence. Therefore, China's achievements in the socialist revolution and the construction period became their observation objects. China as a reference, and the other entered the research vision of Africa and produced a number of research results. The next is the development of the China model in Africa, research in contemporary China. In recent years, the African academic circles on the construction and reform of the Communist Party of China, especially the reference significance of China's development practice for Africa. The China model has become the focus of African Chinese research, drawing lessons from China's development experience and working out of the development path of the African characteristics. It can be divided into three parts. The first one is the reference significance of China's reform and opening up policy and poverty reduction experience for Africa. The second is a community with a shared future for mankind and a China-Africa community. The third is China's practical experience in governance. The next part, I will talk about the characteristics and the methods of African China studies. So first is a characteristics of trends. First, although African China studies started late, and there is still a certain gap between the quality and the quantity of research results compared with European countries and American. Since the 21st century, Africa has developed rapidly on China. The number of research institutions has increased, and China-Africa cooperative research has continued to increase. The Chinese project has been separated from the Confucius Institute in universities and become a separate scientific research institution, serving the study of contemporary China and paying increasing attention to contemporary China. Second, the research subject identity and the research purpose are becoming increasingly complex. African Chinese related scholars have both experience in foreign affairs and also have experience in colleges and universities, set politicians and scholars' identity. So they enjoy the convenience of archives. For example, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the archives of official delegation reports, official letter, and official archives. Many archives content first disclosed in China, but it also determines their research purpose and motivation. It's not solely from academic research, but from the perspective of African political, economical, social, and cultural development. The research content is rich. Third, the research perspective gradually shifted from Western reference to native Africa, and the research method were diversified. Some research use the West as a point of reference to explain China and the Communist Party of China and interpret Western literatures. With the development of China-Africa relations, African scholars pay more attention to local historical materials and use the research methods of oral history and have a more objective understanding of the Communist Party of China. Fourth, since the beginning of the new century, Chinese studies in Africa has focused on the study of CPC governance ideas and the China-Africa relations with rich results and develop different angles. As Onunaiju said, Karl Marx socialism and the second liberation of Africa, many African countries ignore their national conditions and social development and blindly intimate some other political models, so as unable to promote national development. Fifth, some of the African research on China was supported by the foundation and followed the European countries. The sixth, the research results and the value of African sinology or African China studies need to be placed under the context of international Chinese studies research. Some African scholars have been committed to the have been strongly attacking the China and have some different ideas to the Communist Party. So the last one, I just want to talk about the position and the positionality of African Chinese scholars. In fact, there are currently two forms of African China studies. One is China studies in Africa. The second is African Chinese studies. In recent years, in the background of European academic training, many African Chinese studies scholars use I and others. There are two different angles to talk about Chinese studies in Africa. So sometimes they will the development of dragon in the bush, in the jungle. They will use this metaphor closely linked with China's emergence in Africa with Western words such as neocolonialism, imperialism, and Chinese threat. So sinology coach studies in Africa even provide academic intelligence. It is in this context, using Africa as a research center under the framework of the Global South, based on the South-South cooperation between China, Africa, using China as a method, highlighting the subjectivity of African is more necessary and important. So the book, so I will finish my topic is, in general, African China studies focus on different stages in the mid-1950s, the history of China's socialist revolution and constructions, and a new China in the 1980s, and achievements of reform and opening up, governance thoughts, the One Belt Road Initiative, and the construction of a community with a shared future for mankind. A large number of achievements have played a positive role in establishing the China's image in the international community. But we should also note that there are some noteworthy problems in African Chinese studies. The first one is, although the number of research results has surged in the past decade, but the lack of high-quality academic monographs, the research results are not representative. The academic and political influence is limited. It has not formed Chinese content and characteristics in the strict academic sense.
If you can please wrap up a little bit, it's to at your 5 minutes above. If you can wrap up a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. So I will finish my topic. Many thanks for inviting me. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I didn't mean to cut you off, but because of time constraint, we have to kind of manage the time. So thanks for the introduction and your presentation. I'm going to move straight to Abayomi Azikiwe, who is the editor of the Pan-African Newswire, which is an international electronic press service on the affairs of African people throughout the world. Abayomi is a regular contributor to different newsletters or radio programs in North America. You have the mic, Abayomi, Mr. Abayomi.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the panelists and the viewing audience. My presentation is going to deal briefly with 4 areas that are pertinent to how we view Africa-China relations in the 21st century. I'd like to start off talking about the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC. I want to discuss some aspects of the recent visit by the United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, to 3 African states. Also, the whole concept of democracy, the Western concept, the Chinese concept, and also how the concept of international solidarity relates to Africa-China relations. A ministerial summit, in fact, the 8th ministerial summit of the Forum on China and Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, was held just several weeks ago in Dakar, Senegal, in West Africa. It was designed to reinforce the continuing bonds between Beijing and the 55-member African Union. 53 states on the continent have relations with China. Outside of Eswatini, formerly known as Swaziland, and of course the SADR, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, which is not a sovereign state, although it is recognized by the African Union and the United Nations. FOCAC was formed in 2000 during an important period, which was marked by several years of substantial economic growth on the continent of Africa and in the People's Republic of China. Concurrently, over the same last 2 decades, the United States, Britain, the European Union, and their allies globally have been embroiled in numerous imperialist interventions, which have resulted in destabilizations, military interventions, proxy wars, and the expansion of the presence of the Pentagon and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization forces throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America. These imperialist endeavors aimed at maintaining the political and economic domination of the world's population has created enormous difficulties for peoples globally, including the working class and the nationally oppressed and the overall impoverished living in the Western capitalist countries as well. Successive administrations in the United States and Britain have turned away, even rhetorically, from any notion of multilateralism, a reliance on the United Nations to resolve tensions and conflicts as well. They have created the conditions for widespread displacement internationally. The migration crisis in North Africa, the Mediterranean, which is extended into southern Central and Western Europe is a direct result of a series of wars and their aftermaths in countries such as Libya, Mali, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Haiti, to name the most well-known and the most devastating. The 21st century has witnessed US-instigated regime change in numerous states, while the socialist states, such as the People's Republic of China, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, etc., have not embarked upon any destabilization efforts, let alone invasions into other sovereign states. Due to the socialist economic planning and their advancement of the notions of international cooperation and peace among states with varying social systems, there has been tremendous progress in the areas of international solidarity. Another example is the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa grouping, BRICS. It is a manifestation of the role of Beijing, Moscow, and Pretoria, along with other states which have had which has varied in regard to their political orientation in recent years. These new alliances are perceived as a threat to the role of the United States, Britain, and the European Union, since they are not participant members and cannot directly impact the agendas and goals established by FOCAC and BRICS. With specific reference to the structures and objectives of FOCAC, the website of FOCAC says the following. The FOCAC follow-up mechanisms are built at 3 levels. The Ministerial Conference is held every 3 years. The senior officials follow-up meetings and the senior officials preparatory meetings for the Ministerial Conference are held respectively in the year and a few days before the Ministerial Conference is held. And the consultations between the African Diplomatic Corps in China and the Secretariat of the Chinese Follow-up Committee are held at least twice a year. The Ministerial Conference and the senior officials meeting are held alternatively in China and an African country, with China and the African host being co-chairs presiding over the meetings and taking the lead in implementing the outcomes of the meetings. The Ministerial Conference is attended by foreign ministers and ministers in charge of international cooperation and the senior officials meeting by director general levels and officials of the competent departments of China as well as African countries. At a recent 8th ministerial meeting of FOCAC in Senegal, a myriad of issues were discussed, including trade, investment, climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic, along with the distribution and manufacturing of vaccines. The gathering in Senegal coincided with the publication of a white paper by the Chinese government on China-Africa cooperation. Now I want to move up to discuss the State Department, which deployed Antony Blinken in a failed attempt to weaken the FOCAC conference. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited 3 African states during November. It was done in many regards to attempt to counteract the impact of FOCAC. Blinken traveled to Kenya in East Africa, Senegal and West Africa, the location of the FOCAC conference, and the Federal Republic of Nigeria, which is the most populous state on the African continent. Objectively, no serious observer could argue that the foreign policy of the current president, Joe Biden, differs fundamentally from his predecessor, Donald J. Trump, in reference to the African Union member states. This lack of even a slight shift in policy towards Africa is reflected in the current conflict in the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, where Washington is backing a rebel group, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which previously was the leading force in the country's government prior to 2018. So of course, coinciding with the US chief envoy's trip to Africa, the talking points claiming Chinese debt traps, which have been touched on earlier, surfaced in the corporate media. Both Chinese and African officials dismiss such characterizations of the relations between the two geopolitical regions. I'd also like to touch on the concept of democracy, the US versus China. There was also a white paper issued in China explaining the concepts of democratic governance embodied within the program of the Communist Party, distinguishing its definition from what prevails in the United States. The US promotes itself as the citadel of world democracy, placing human rights as a cornerstone of its foreign policy. This white paper entitled China, Democracy That Works, which suggests that the Western forms of democracy have extreme deficiencies. We could look at the worsening economic conditions in the United States. This has served to inflame already existing social contradictions within the society. The country, the United States, was founded on the seizure of lands of the indigenous people. They were forcefully removed. There was mass extermination of the indigenous people in the United States as well. Even today, the indigenous people are largely relegated to reservations where many have been subjected to dangerous intrusions into their territories by multinational energy corporations that poison the soil and the water resources. As far as the descendants of African people are concerned, even though the Civil War ended 156 years ago, after nearly 2.5 centuries of enslavement under Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands within North America, there is widespread state-sponsored racism across the country where people are often impeded, harassed, arrested, prosecuted, falsely imprisoned, and even killed by law enforcement personnel. To conclude, I just wanted to mention that China and Africa have similarities in their historical development, being post-colonial geopolitical regions seeking to reaffirm their places within an international community of nations and peoples. China, under socialist construction, has moved within a reachable distance to surpass the United States in economic status. The main differences is that the US built its wealth on the expropriation of indigenous land and the enslavement of Africans. During the mid-19th century, Mexico had huge swaths of this territory stolen by Washington under the guise of manifest destiny. In this period, the people of Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean are being blocked, incarcerated in federal detention facilities, and deported from the United States on a routine basis. People in North America must not be misled into taking a hostile position towards China and the burgeoning conflict between Washington and Beijing. The role of FOCAC and other structures guiding China-Africa cooperation should be studied as a model for greater international solidarity among working and oppressed people across the globe. Thank you so much once again for the invitation to participate in this webinar.
Thank you so much, Mr. Abayomi Azikiwe. The next presenters, we have a joint presentation by two people, Yan Herong and Barry Southman. They will do a joint presentation, so they may have a little bit longer time, maybe around 15 minutes. Yan Herong is the author of New Masters, New Servants, Migration, Development, and Women Workers in China. She's also co-author of East Mountain Tiger, China, Africa, and the West and Colonialism in Africa. She teaches at Hong Kong Polytechnic University. Barry Southman is a professor at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He's a specialist in international law, particularly in its application to Africa-China relation. He's a co-author with Yan Herong of East Mountain Tiger, West Mountain Tiger, China, Africa, the West, and Colonialism in Africa. So the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Barry, I'll just wait for your screen sharing.
Can you see it? Sorry. Hello?
Hello, yes, we can hear you, but we can't hear.
Well,
Right. Okay.
sorry? Sorry?
Right. My internet is not very stable, so I just lost the connection. Let me turn off my video. Sorry. Excuse me for just, you're going to hear just my voice. Since mid-2000, the question we're going to deal with, Barry and I, will be on whether China practices colonialism in Africa. Of course, our answer is no. Since mid-2000s, Western politicians and media have alleged China practices neocolonialism in Africa. Their claims play on misunderstandings or reductionist understandings of modern colonialism, such as that colonialism can be reduced to one transnational imbalance. For example, colonialism is present where one country trades its manufactured goods for another country's primary products. A colonialist label is attached to China in order to displace criticisms of Western powers, both of their colonial legacies and of current neoliberal policies that Western entities impose on Africa. This label reflects not the reality, but Western elites' perception that they face a global struggle with a formidable competitor, China. While the colonialist label has no basis, Chinese companies in Africa still may behave much like those from other countries, reproducing some of the problems of the current global system. It is worth noting that Western political elites mainly talk positively about their own history of colonialism. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was such a defender. In 1988, she stated, "The story of how Europeans explored and colonized, and yes, without apology, civilized much of the world, is an extraordinary tale of talent, skill, and courage." Tony Blair of the Labour Party had a similar view. In 1997, he stated, "There's a lot of rubbish talked about the empire. In my view, we should not either be apologizing for it or wringing our hands about it. It was in many ways a most extraordinary achievement." France's parliament passed a law in 2005 that demanded that schools teach that French colonialism was beneficial, especially in North Africa. US President, going back. US President George Bush Jr. had one time also, Barry, it's the wrong page.
No, it's the next page.
Okay. Okay, give me the next page. Claims that colonialism civilized the natives included persistent conservative justification of slavery as needed to transform savage Africans. They accord with the common white man's burden assumption that subjugated peoples were backward and incapable of creating industry, good governance, and a culture that serves their own good. For example, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has stated that British planted coffee, cotton, tobacco in Uganda, but if left to their own devices, the natives would have relied on nothing but bananas. US President George W. Bush in 2000s positively analogized the US conquest of Iraq to US colonization of the Philippines. And some US writers in 2000s also said the US should colonize parts of the developing world, especially in Africa and the Middle East. One such example is the liberal US journalist William Pfaff, who argued in the leading journal Foreign Affairs that because there's a lack of civil society in much of Africa, therefore Africa, he argued, one could call for a disinterested neocolonialism. Since late 1980s, across the political spectrum in the US, there has been a moral condemnation of the global South. And it is linked to vindication of colonialism to boost the moral credibility of the West. Most definitions, so from here on, I'm going to discuss characteristics of modern colonialism to set up a comparative framework. So in the second part, Barry can discuss Chinese practices in Africa. Most definitions of colonialism capture only one aspect of what is distinctive about it, and many definitions confuse colonialism with empire, dependency, or settlement, with transnational political influence, or with disadvantageous trade and investment. And based on our own study of the cases, colonialism involved a degree of control of economic and political development that is inconceivable in informal interdependencies. It included a complete loss of sovereignty and often almost total exclusion from power of local elites. So our definition is that colonialism is a relationship in which alien Western and Japanese rulers in subdued overseas lands practiced exclusionary authoritarian rule, imposed explicit racial hierarchy, enriched metropolitan and colonizing elites by monopoly exploitation of the colony's natural resources, labor, and trade, and depleted, impoverished their native populations, while often extirpating the cultures of the most vulnerable colonized peoples. The Polish-British writer Joseph Conrad, in his 1899 novel, The Heart of Darkness, called the ongoing final colonization of Africa the vilest scramble for loot that ever disfigured the history of human conscience. In 1770, the so-called economic backwardness was found among only 10% of the world's population. 90% were on a roughly equal plane of development. Colonial mode exploitation, however, demanded that colonies could only import products from the colonizing metropoles and had to maintain very low or no tariffs. Colonial exports could only be made to metropoles from where they were often re-exported. Production of manufactured goods in the colonies that could compete with metropole products was banned. Transport between colonies and metropoles were only on metropole ships. Such conditions, according to French historian Paul Béroche and Guyanese historian Walter Rodney, led to a lack of diffusion of industrial revolution to the colonies or Africa's deindustrialization. Modern colonialism and the slavery related to it produced demographic catastrophes in the colonized world, which also contributed to colonized people's de-development. So, but colonizing countries actually gained demographic reward of colonialism. So wealth from slave trade and colonies limited colonizing countries' immigration and
Looks like your connection has dropped. You can proceed, maybe, Barry.
Yeah, I'll do that. So colonized countries gained demographic rewards from colonialism. Wealth from the slave trade and colonies limited colonizing countries' immigration and reduced their mortality rates. The principal colonies were supposed to provide monopoly profits for the colonialists. A 19th century French official in Algeria said that a colony's utility equals the total of profits and advantages that the metropole accrues. Unprofitable colonies were usually abandoned. The British Empire had 80% of colonized peoples, and during most of the colonial era was hugely profitable. Costs of colonialism were socialized, but profits went to bankers, traders, colonizers, and usually the state. According to Leo Goodstad, a leading historian of Hong Kong, the imperial tradition required colonial territories to invest their reserves in British and Commonwealth securities, to embrace the sterling area's exchange controls, to procure supplies through crown agents in London, and to use commercial and technical standards from Britain. Until the 1970s, these imperial conventions served to direct business toward the United Kingdom and to restrict market opportunities for the rest of the world. Defense arrangements, too, appeared to provide Hong Kong with a British garrison at an unnecessarily high price. In Africa, native entrepreneurs were so restricted that they disappeared. Existing trade was destroyed in order to divert attention to producing export crops for European industries and importing European manufacturers. The growth of Africa's urban population stagnated at 10% in the colonial period, despite an influx of urban non-Africans, while the world's urban population grew from 9% in 1600 to 20% in 1900. Colonial rulers typically limited the amount and kind of investment by others. They curbed or banned native industries that competed with those of the metropole. They seized land and gave it to settlers. They redistributed the rural population and forced it to grow cash crops to better extract high and regressive taxes to finance their administration. Natives in modern colonies have been politically subordinate to colonizers. Discrimination was exceptionally harsh in Africa, but systematic even in such colonies as Hong Kong and the US's possessions. Power resided with the governor and his expatriate lieutenants in Hong Kong, for example. Top bureaucrats were from the metropole. In Hong Kong, the British governor appointed all members of governing institutions from 1842 until indirect elections were staged in 1985. And almost no Chinese served in government until after World War II. In Hong Kong, British judges punished Chinese defendants much more severely than Western defendants. In many colonies, communication with the government had to be in the colonial language. In Macau, for example, legal documents were only in Portuguese, the language of 2% of residents. The imported church was privileged. The Catholic Church in Macau represented 6% of the population, but was in charge of schooling the natives. Few colonized people were accorded citizenship. No colonies in their heyday gave natives rights equal to those of colonialists. According to Osterhammel, a famous scholar of colonialism, the split of colonial law into one set of laws for foreigners and another for natives sometimes led to a blatant double standard of justice according to race, especially in settler colonies such as Algeria, where there was an especially harsh and demeaning code indigena for the Algerians. A double standard of justice was also found in exploitation colonies such as Japanese Taiwan. In Africa, the medical establishment was almost exclusively for the benefit of the European population. In Britain's colony of Sierra Leone, 3% of children attended school. The percentage was even lower in such British colonies as Gambia and northern Nigeria. Inequality was everywhere in the colonies. Resistance to colonialism was met with ferocious extra-legal repression. More than 100,000 Kikuyu in Kenya died, many by hangings and torture in concentration camps where Britain fought anti-colonial rebels from 1952 to 1960. As many as 1 million Algerians were killed from 1954 to 1962 when the French colonialists attempted to keep Algeria French. As Jonathan Kriekhaus, the development analyst, has put it, by far the best colonial legacy was not to be colonized at all. Countries that avoided European colonization, as in select parts of Asia, frequently enjoyed highly efficacious states and societies, resulting in rapid economic growth. Indeed, colonialism was a catastrophe for the colonized. The same, however, cannot be said about China's practices in Africa, which I will now turn to. Mainstream Western politicians and media, especially in the US and UK, claim China practices neocolonialism in Africa. The US, however, largely backed colonialism from the 1950s to 1970s and supported the white racist regime in South Africa until the late 1980s. China opposed colonialism, training African anti-colonial fighters. To be a colonial power, China would have to practice a colonial mode of accumulation. It would have to force African elites to make decisions that China favors, engage in racial oppression, and enrich China by monopolies of African resources, trade, and labor. But China does not directly or indirectly control any African state. Meanwhile, the US and UK control most of the world's remaining colonies. Western sources often cite the same cases of so-called Chinese control in Africa, Sudan and Zimbabwe. These are two states, by the way, where we've done field work. Sudan is not dependent on China for sustaining the regime or for waging war. It is Sudanizing its main industry, oil. Oil is, of course, fungible. Sudan sells it on the international market. The China-Sudan relationship involves much less control than the US exercised in 21st century Iraq or Afghanistan. There, the US sponsored security forces, promulgated legal codes, propped up favored political forces, etc. There is no indication that China exercises substantial leverage in Zimbabwe. Its trade with Zimbabwe is less than 1% of its trade with Africa. About 1% of Zimbabwe's exports go to China, and 8.5% of its imports come from China. China's stock of outbound foreign direct investment in Africa, 47 billion US dollars, is 2% of its global OFDI. Its flow of investment to Africa in the first 3 quarters of this year was $2.5 billion. Again, only about 2% of the flow of China's OFDI to the world. China's stock of Zimbabwean investment is about 1 billion US dollars, mainly in developing a new integrated industry, steel. Most foreign investment in Zimbabwe is from South Africa, although Russian investment in Zimbabwean mining alone is over $5 billion. China actually has so little control over Zimbabwe's government that its ambassador had to ask that the Zimbabwe-China investment treaty be respected by not requiring sale of majority ownership in Chinese firms to Zimbabweans. South Africa, in fact, has great leverage in Zimbabwe. It controls its electricity, grain, and oil imports. Now, some individual Chinese, of course, are racist. After all, it's 1.4 billion people. But China can't promote racism as supporters of colonialism do. A Chinese newspaper could never publish anything like what was written by the editor of the Sunday Telegraph, which is the unofficial organ of the UK's Conservative Party. He wrote that Africa will never enjoy the blessings of peace and prosperity and escape the curses of civil war, famine, pestilence, and genocide until the white man once again takes over political control. Chinese neocolonialism in Africa is sometimes framed as Africans selling primary products to China while Chinese sell manufactured goods to Africa. But this unequal trade is not only found in colonial relationships. In the 19th century, the US sold Britain primary products while Britain sold manufactures to the US. The US was not Britain's colony, however. Today, Canada, India, Australia, etc., mainly sell primary products to China, which sells manufactured goods to them. No one thinks these countries are Chinese colonies. Colonialists forced their African and other colonies to only produce primary products and forced them to receive manufactured goods from the colonizing country. China does not exercise such force against any country. Much of what China sells to Africa is industrial equipment that contributes to manufacturing in Africa. Moreover, Carnegie International Economics Program researchers have noted that Chinese and African exports overlap in only few industries, such as clothing and textiles, which suggests limited competition in third markets. For example, the Export Similarity Index, a measure of the extent to which exports overlap, is only 7.3% between Africa, excluding South Africa, and China. Manufacturers account for only 20% of Africa's exports as compared to China's 95%, suggesting that China provides little competition to Africa's exports. Poor infrastructure is, of course, a major factor inhibiting development in Africa. China is the main source of funds for and main builder of infrastructure in Africa, which is, of course, the precursor of the continent's industrialization. Chinese firms build for profit, often in the range of 5 to 10%, but that's much lower than Western firms, which typically expect 25 to 35% profit. For example, in Tanzania, Chinese firms build roads for on average 600,000 US dollars per kilometer. Western firms charge $1 million per kilometer. Chinese building African infrastructure live under conditions not at all comparable to colonialists. They often live under much harsher conditions than most expatriate Westerners have in Africa. Some Chinese in Africa lead lives not very different from most Africans. Chinese are, of course, famous for hard work, including participation at times by managers, engineers, and skilled workers in physical labor, not something colonialists did. Very few of the large plantations in Africa are owned by Chinese. China has a few oil blocks in Africa, and Chinese-owned mines in Africa are far from being the largest or most profitable. Regarding trade, China is sometimes accused of mercantilism. Mercantilism, however, was a 17th to 18th century system that held that there is a finite global volume of trade. The state should promote specific exports by private firm activity. There should be restrictions on specific imports through high tariff barriers, and trade surpluses should be pursued. That was mercantilism. Mercantilist Britain enforced laws to exclude all foreign merchants from many American colonies. It required that manufacturers, slaves, capital, and credit be obtained only from British sources. But China does not seek a trade surplus with Africa. Since the year 2000, China has had $1.2 trillion of imports from Africa and $1.27 trillion in exports to Africa. Annual trade is now about 200 billion US dollars. Imports from and exports to Africa are each some $100 billion. China does not push specific exports to Africa. It does not restrict most imports from Africa, but facilitates many by abolishing or lowering tariffs. The US and the EU, however, subsidize their own farmers and place high tariffs on some agricultural imports from Africa. Mercantilism was a system suited to developing European colonialism, but is not suited to modern economies. It thus has no apparent relation to Chinese practices in Africa. The Chinese government is in fact said to be keen to differentiate its Africa policy from those of the former colonial powers by stressing its hands-off approach. A Chinese diplomat in South Africa has said that non-intervention is our brand, like intervention is the Americans' brand. Another way, of course, is to aid African education, which colonialists hardly did. In 2020-21, China was the largest single provider of university scholarships to students from sub-Saharan Africa. 12,000 of the total of 30,000 bursaries distributed by the top 50 global donors. Almost all Africans who study in China return to Africa. Brain gain from training Africans in China contrasts with African brain drain to the US and Europe, from which only 25 to 45% of African scholarship students return. China has set up vocational education and capacity building centers in Africa to train hundreds of thousands of African technicians. Tens of thousands of African students have had training opportunities in China. China has 1,000 doctors and nurses serving in 45 African countries and training African counterparts at any given time. And of course, it's sending 1,500 more to aid the anti-COVID fight and has provided Africa with millions of doses of vaccine and will provide 1 billion more in 2022. A Nigerian scholar has observed that China's emergence as a major economic power in the 1990s, despite not being a democracy or adopting economic policies typically recommended by the international financial institutions, has become a source of great interest for both Africa's rulers and ruled. The China as colonialism discourse intends to mitigate such interests. It seeks to blunt the strategic competition Western elites think they have with China in Africa. Western elites seek through this discourse to, first of all, demonstrate the superiority of liberal political systems. They also want to present Western influence as necessary to African advancement, to include the history of colonial offenses against colonized people, to vindicate Western neoliberal opposition to so-called state-centered development, and to boost nationalism in the historically colonizing countries while facilitating their future competition with China. Westerners who identify with colonialism or want to redeem it by claiming it had good aspects are trying to transfer the stigma of colonial oppression to Chinese. To argue China is not engaged in African colonialism is, of course, not to say that no Chinese exploit or oppress Africans. China is partly linked to the post-colonial capitalism in Africa that derives from the gross inequality and power asymmetry that was first created by colonialism. China, as a trade-driven industrial power, is integrated into a world system that's fixed on national wealth and power. China thus impacts Africa through its semi-neoliberalism. It partly replicates the developed states' policies in Africa of disadvantageous terms of trade, exploitation of natural resources, oppressive labor regimes, and support for malign rulers. It is not likely, however, that China will become a colonial power in the future. Colonialism is unpopular, except among Western elites and a few elite people in ex-colonies. China's government can still decide to act differently from Western states in important regards. For example, unlike Western governments, it can still command its SOEs and influence private firms to not have Western companies' profit maximization standards, thus staying away from one of the major drivers of colonialism. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jan and Barry. Unfortunately, the internet connection of Jan was not very stable, but Barry was able to proceed and then complete the presentation. We have two more panelists that I'm going to introduce very quickly. Christine Pleiss is a member of the Toronto chapter of GRILA. Is a professor of sociology at the University of Toronto. She's a co-author of a book called Capitalism and Its Uncertain Future, and also the author of a book called Brewing Resistance, Indian Coffee House and the Emergency in Post-Colonial India. Christine, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Ameth. So hello, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for this very important conversation on Africa-China relations. And thanks so very much to Ameth and to John for organizing. My comments for today are largely a product of study sessions that GRILA Toronto held to think through these issues as a collective, but I will also incorporate some of my own thoughts. So I want to begin today on the question of cooperation and development, given that this phrase is in the title of the event. The central hinge in this conversation, in my view, is should we celebrate the contemporary relationship between African states and China as in the genre of South-South development that the Global South dreamed of in the mid-20th century, or are contemporary Africa-China relations a new imperialist dynamic emerging through the crisis of US hegemony as China assumes the role of an emerging world power? As Vijay Prashad elucidates in The Darker Nations, the Third World is not a place, but a political project. In the mid-20th century, at the height of US hegemony, the Global South imagined political, economic, and social emancipation. One important incarnation of this, as was mentioned by Ameth in the introductions to this event today, was the Bandung Conference in 1955, where representatives of 29 newly independent Asian and African states met to promote what's now termed South-South cooperation. In other words, the idea that African and Asian states could come together for economic and cultural cooperation and together oppose colonialism and imperialism. Bandung, as we mentioned earlier, was institutionalized in the aligned movement, but the non-aligned movement was not without its critics. So Muammar Gaddafi famously said of the non-aligned movement that the world is made up of two camps, the liberation camp and the imperialist one. There's no place for those who are non-aligned, we're not neutral and totally aligned against the aggressor. And as Gaddafi saw it, the global South was not comprised of states who were beholden to US imperialism on the one hand, states beholden to Soviet imperialism on another, and then the states that opposed either influence. In Gaddafi's assessment, there were only two states, those who were against imperialism and for liberation, and others that were imperialist or dominated by imperialism. So our understandings of contemporary imperialism, however, are shaped by the lived experience of the 20th century of US hegemony and the particular way in which it supplanted European colonial rule with new dependent relationships of exploitation of the same character, but through new forms of politico-economic relationships between the United States and the global South. But with the crisis of US hegemony starting in the 1970s, and now with a more pronounced global crisis since 2008 of perhaps the capitalist world system itself, imperialism as we know it will also necessarily change. Forms of power and hierarchy need to be remade so that they can continue on as they lose moral authority. The United States has lost its moral authority for global rule, providing openings for a new hegemonic power to emerge and to lead the world economy in overcoming the current crisis. For example, the transition from British hegemony in the 19th century to US hegemony in the 20th, we see imperialism persist, but the form it took changed. Formal colonialism lost its moral authority, which led to the important development of flag independence across much of the global South. But in this absence of formal political rule through colonialism, the United States innovated new articulations of imperialism during the Cold War and beyond. Any new hegemon, as part of its rule, must convince the rest of the world that it is acting in the best interests of the interstate system. Part of the establishment of that consent to rule entails forming dependent relationships with the global South that appear to be in the best interests of the global South. With the rise of a new world hegemon, imperialism must necessarily be remade to look like aid, cooperation, and solidarity. This helps the rising hegemon establish a global moral authority as it appears to be acting in the moral interests of the entire world economy. In these phases of world history where a new hegemon is on the rise, it's critically important that we can distinguish between true South-South cooperation that has the potential for national liberation from a new incarnation of imperialism in its guise. When we examine this distinction between South-South cooperation on the one hand and contemporary imperialism from the perspective on the ground, it's critically important to understand local political conditions that can create an imbalance of power. Therefore, we must better understand the contemporary dynamics of African sovereignty. While the 21st century began with revolutions to oust decades of post-colonial authoritarian rule in places like Egypt, Tunisia, Sudan, and elsewhere, these efforts were short-lived. Counter-revolutionary forces, particularly those led by right-wing nationalists and conservative religious leaders, too often became the eventual beneficiaries of movements that toppled authoritarian regimes. And in recent years, we've witnessed more counter-revolutions and coups across the African continent. In Chad, for example, states succumbing to authoritarianism has become more prevalent, and we seldom observe revolutions that have been successful at installing long-lasting democratic states committed to promoting the interests of African people. In this fraught context of authoritarian rule across the continent, it's been easier for imperialists to usurp African sovereignty. Just as European and North American states have found authoritarian rule in Africa more amenable to their political economic interests, so too has China. In Zambia, for example, copper mining accounts for 65% of the country's export earnings. Most of the mines are owned by the Chinese state, though few are mining companies with headquarters in Canada. Foreign mining companies have been able to create pockets of Chinese state sovereignty within Zambia, where labor laws are notoriously lax, wages low, accidents and deaths of workers prevalent. When workers have protested these conditions, they've been met with violence, not from the Zambian state, but from Chinese management, who's met workers' demands by deploying violence without consequence. Another example would be the Lamu project to build a deep water port connecting East Africa to Asian export markets, which was initially funded by the Kenyan, Ethiopian, and South Sudanese states. But because of funding issues and occasional attacks on port construction by al-Shabaab, Kenyan Defense Forces sought loans from China, which were supported through the Maritime Silk Road program, which is a policy not only to aid China in gaining further access to African resources and markets, but also to enable the People's Liberation Army Navy to establish a counterterrorism base in northern Kenya. Ports are crucial to African development, as 90% of East African exporters depend on seaports to remain viable. But if Kenya defaults on the debt they've incurred, which seems likely, the Lamu port will soon become yet another space of Chinese state sovereignty in sub-Saharan Africa. Land grabbing through creating pockets of Chinese state sovereignty and through control of strategic assets has helped China obtain cheap natural resources needed for industrial production, while railroads, other infrastructure, along with access to seaports, allows for the extraction of these resources from sub-Saharan Africa. Regime change has not been successful in disrupting this dynamic because the movements for regime change have mostly focused on ousting political leaders. But as a result of European and North American imperialism, and also through the support of the domestic bourgeoisie, sovereignty in most African states rests with the military. Recent revolutions have done little to disrupt this or to create states that will serve the interests of the people. Since the mid-20th century, the most commonly proposed left solution to neocolonialism and imperialism has been delinking. In this era of globalization, however, we've seen, especially during the pandemic, that cutting off Africa's ties to the global economy can hurt the very people delinking tends to liberate. Yet there's a difference between globalization done on the terms of more powerful states and a horizontal internationalism based on solidarity. Africa-China relations in and of themselves could bring great benefit to both regions, but as long as there remains a power differential in African states' individual dealings with China, it will remain a tie that will ultimately result in economic benefit for China and the exploitation of Africa. One possible solution could be to have negotiations around Chinese development projects in African states done as a regional bloc through a Pan-African Union rather than country by country. But beyond this, what we as an internationalist left can do is decenter the role of the state in Africa-China relations. If civil society and leftist groups in both China and across the African continent could work together across borders, it could put pressure on states to realize common social injustices in both China and in various African contexts, such as the importance of opposing authoritarian regimes that fail to serve the best interests of the people and promoting workers' rights through a labor internationalism. We can also envision linkages between other Chinese and Pan-African civil society organizations around common issues that are relevant to both the African and Chinese contexts. Frantz Fanon famously described the Third World Project, as he called it, as a rejection of the goal of catching up to Europe and North America, and instead saw its primary goal to innovate a new way of thinking. Fanon believed in the creativity of the revolutionary leftist global South, that new forms of politics could be envisioned and enacted that would provide solutions to long-standing social problems. There's a tendency within the global North left to see any political development that opposes Western dominance as something to celebrate. But in thinking through the complexity of contemporary Africa-China relations, it's evident that we need to be more discerning about the dynamics of power involved in the movements that may claim to be South-South cooperation and/or anti-Western. They may yet be an embodiment of the unequal power dynamics and politico-economic exploitation we stand firmly against. Propaganda, as many of esteemed colleagues have mentioned, coming from the West, but also from China, obscures the power dynamics at play on the ground in Sino-African relations. The ability of propaganda to muddy our understanding of the dynamics at play makes organizing around these issues particularly difficult and controversial. But we need to remember, as leftists based in Canada or anywhere else for that matter, that just because something is anti-West doesn't make it automatically liberatory. So we need to be thoughtful and discerning about how we think about power and history in our contemporary context. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the conversation and questions.
Thank you so much, Christine, for your presentation. And we're going to move to the last panelist, Pablo Edohosa, who is a professor of African Studies at York University here in Toronto, with a specialty in national development and modernity in Africa. He is the author of a book called The Norms of Displacement, NGO, Globalization, and the State in Africa. Pablo, you will have the mic.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everyone. And my thanks to John and to Ameth, as well as Redika, for coordinating this event, this international event, and to all my co-panelists, whom I've learned a great deal from, and who in many ways have kind of taken the sustenance out of much of what I wanted to say. But nonetheless, I'll also use in some ways. So my thanks to Daniel, to Huang, to Abayomi, to all the others, I'm sorry, for their presentations. And there are really three things that I want to say, in part drawing from what others have said, but also in some sense my own take on much of this debate. One of the things I was actually going to talk about was soft power, and the degree to which soft power can become a means through and by which government, states, powers can influence countries in different ways. And whilst on the one hand, I'm both thankful and mindful of what Huang said about the extraordinary ways in which China has reconfigured and reshaped how knowledge is produced and knowledge is understood and knowledge is situated, we don't want it to become another form of the British Council or the Alliance Francaise in terms of, in some sense, reconsolidating the ways in which soft power is used to reinforce people's understandings of different places. But that's not my primary concern here. My primary concern is really twofold. One is, once again, to reinforce the different conceptions or understandings of imperialism and not colonialism, or to differentiate the two, the two, we might say, moments. It doesn't seem to me that Chinese is a colonial power, but as somebody pointed out, it is part, in some sense, of a contestation over the ways in which the conduits of resources are utilized in different parts of the world. And in some ways, that is part of colonialism, but it is also part of an imperial project to consolidate power and rule. The second point I wanted to make really is the issue about development. It's been brought up that China has been, in sense, a different model of understanding how development takes place throughout the globe. And about that, I would agree. And some of that has to do, of course, with the way in which China has a hands-off approach, we might say, to the ways in which development elites in different African countries pursue their goals. And it has to be said, and this goes back to what Daniel said, we have to give African states and the agents within states their own agency. It's not all one way. But nonetheless, we do have to have some sets of measures as to how, one, we understand the process of how development has been improved in the short term, and we might say in the long term, And secondly, whether or not China in different ways consolidates one aspect of, we might say, imperial or imperialist rivalry. So I'm going to link these in a very unoriginal way, which has been used by a number of, we might say, mainstream political economists. And that's to look at, in some sense, the direct and indirect effect of China's role in Africa as a site of measurement, right? So that we're not constantly engaged in this kind of epiphenomenal understanding of the impact of Chinese involvement in Africa. If I can just give two quick examples of that before I move on. One is a personal one from a friend of mine who's a Congolese, who made the point that throughout the history of colonialism under the Belgians, and then subsequently under the French and the Americans, that no road had been built from his village to the main regional city where he's from. The first road that was ever built was by the Chinese. Now, most people would say that's a good instance and a good illustration of a form of development that is not linked to the kind of instrumentalism that characterized a great deal of infrastructural development under colonialism. That is to say, roads were only built to the extent that they facilitated colonial trade. This appears to be an instance of China engaging in infrastructural development in and of itself because it benefits a local population. And I would support that both as an illustration of, we might say, intrinsic development in and of itself, and we might also say soft power as a form of identifying a certain kind of doing things differently. The second is a recent series of problems in a country that just recently had an election in Gambia, where a plant that has been built by China for the purpose of essentially fish feed for Chinese farms elsewhere, right? So a great deal of local fish food is used for the purpose of putting this into fish farms in places as different as the Sudan, as well as in China. And some of the extraordinary polluting effects that have come from this, right? So this is one illustration of a particular company in China that is linked to the Chinese state, which has deleterious effects upon a local economy, yet at the same time is increasing the GDP of Gambia itself. So we're caught between these two tensions on the one hand, where we have what one might call an example of the direct effect of Chinese investment in a particular place. The issue for us, however, is broader. There are two parts of this. One, the broad effect, which is how do we understand this in the context of the overall impact of Chinese investment in Africa? So we need to disaggregate some of the figures that, for example, were issued earlier by Barry and by Daniel, right? So we need to break that down and not just have these global figures that say, here are this investment, here are these terms of trade, this is good, this is better than what happens in the West. The West is not the measure, nor should be the measure or the only measure by which we assess whether China does well or not. One can say that the environmental impact upon these local communities, particularly upon these coastal communities, is devastating. At the same time, macroeconomically, we can say without equivocation that there have, in fact, been value added to the Gambian economy. It's these kinds of tensions that I think people need to understand. And this gets back to Christian's point about the mode of development in different kinds of places. So what I'm going to do now is to just, in a sense, finish off to talk about the different ways in which we can understand. And there are really 6 areas. One is trade, right? What is the nature of the growth of exports to China, right? Is it negative? What are the displacements that takes place in this trade? Are producers displaced from China? What about FDI projects? What is the nature of the inflows into different parts of Africa? And again, we need to disaggregate, right? Because South Africa is not the Gambia. Egypt is not Lesotho, right? So we need to have some understanding of Africa as a whole, but we also need to understand the local specific context within which these FDI flows and these technologies take place. So do Chinese firms displace local industries? And if so, what is the take-up from that? is there greater employment? Is the nature of that employment in any ways improved? Is there greater integration into global markets where there's value added for African products? Or can we say that there's a diversion from these places that benefits OECD countries and which also favors China's, right? Let's take a look at finance. What's the nature of that additional finance? Many of the panelists today have talked about the differentiating nature of finance. And it's clear that the nature of the financial relationship between China and Africa and what existed, certainly through international agencies like the World Bank and the IMF, and the bilateral agencies of Europe and the global North, are very, very different in many ways than what China's had on offer. But even here, one needs to understand what is the nature of those additional resources in finance and where do they go? Are they unsustainable? Do they increase indebtedness? Once again, rather than have those global figures, one needs to look at how they have an impact specifically on given countries and what the nature of the relationship between those countries and China is. One can talk about the social, right? We've already talked about about employment and increased employment. Is employment created? Let's take, for example, one instance of this that's unequivocal. 25,000 people were employed by China in the Mombasa to Nairobi train development, right? A fantastic infrastructure project. That's not only about Kenya, but it's also about the region as a whole, both those in beyond Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and so on. So here we have an infrastructure project that's unequivocally of benefit to regional investment, trade overall. And also, of course, that it provided employment, one of the consequences of which is going to have a multiplier effect upon the economy overall, right? So this is an example then that has not just an economic impact, but a broader social impact that's going to have all these different kinds of changes throughout the economy. But there are also instances of displacement, right? Through dams and through various infrastructure projects that might take place. I want to again reemphasize, and this is not a point of comparison with the West. This ought not to be the only measure by which one assesses the extent, the degree, and how much, in many ways, the relationship between China and African states are reconfigured and consolidated upon patterns or understandings of inequality that one would anticipate would generally be the case, but also how those inequalities are, in some sense, reinforced. So one can look, of course, at the increased revenues that come from the various resources that are generated from FDI. So you have a greater taxation base that can be, in principle, the site for or a source of greater redistribution. It's all contingent, it all depends, and much is lost in the detail. Now this links obviously to the politics and the polity space that operates for African states as well. And as Christians rightly point out, and as others have hinted at, it's not, once again, a matter of indicating a model that is pre-existing for many African countries and African states, but rather what alternatives are available to, we might say, the popular classes on the ground. So whether it's a reconsolidation of forms of autocracy and authoritarianism, even where that hands-off has allowed for a policy space that was hitherto unavailable previously under neoliberal circumstances, under the liberalization, stabilization and adjustment regimes. One can talk about human rights, one can talk about all these different kinds of things, but I'll leave it there. The final, and I've hinted at this from the outset, from the example of Gambia, of course, is the environment, right? Are Chinese firms operating in unstable ecological and environmental zones? If so, what is the ability of local communities and or the African states, should they be so interested in negotiating with Chinese firms and the Chinese state around these fragile ecological zones? To what extent are there, and this is one area that, of course, China is a leader, and that is to say, looking at renewable resources. To what extent is that kind of technology being introduced into Africa and so on, right? So one could elaborate a mapping of, we might say, what we used to call in our discourse and development, of a certain kind of development that's either intentional or imminent. That is to say, whether the intention to develop leads to consequences that have been part of the pattern of the history of development that many of us no longer find acceptable. The other question is whether within that model of development assistance, across the range of industries, across the sectors of the economy, whether it's agricultural or industry, or whether these trading patterns reinforce an imminence to development that's going to lend itself to the kinds of displacement that we've historically seen in the context of the development so-called that's come from the West. The final point I'm going to make, and this is really throwing it out to all of us here, is the issue of imperialism, right? I don't think China's an imperial power in the sense in which historically we can clearly identify the West as being, whether it's your colonial powers, whether it's the United States, or whether it's new actors that play a role. But that is not really the issue. The real issue about imperialism is in some ways rule by another means, but also consolidating certain facets of inequality. And I'm going to list three, and they're not mine. They come from two Indian economists who may be well known to people here. One is increasing the supply size. So we can ask the question, what is the nature of the supply of commodities that Africa is continuing to maintain? Is it increased? And this gets back to the earlier points, right? As to whether or not that increases the value to those African countries. The second, and we've seen this in the context of neoliberalism, which is, say, the value of money, right? What is the nature of that value of money? Well, one of the ways in which it's been done through the system of imposed comparative advantage in the context of neoliberal regimes is, of course, to reduce the value of African money, right? And by that, I mean both the currency, but also the overall quanta of revenues from trade. And the third, and for me the most important, is what they call income deflation, which is to say, what is in fact the revenues that are generated for the vast majority of the popular classes in Africa. Imperialism wants to drive down, in fact, the income of most of the constituents, what we would call the popular classes. If any of those three happen, then we've got some matrix of understanding imperialism more than just simply by identifying it through aggregate flows. They in and of themselves don't tell us the nature of imperialism. I would say that broadly speaking, overall, not just the epiphenomenal features, the road in the Congo, perhaps the fish farms in various parts of Africa, but rather the overall effect and impact of trying to understand these three components of these new modes of imperialism. Thank you, everyone. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Pablo. And again, thank you very much for all the panelists and presenters. A very important point that were made. The general conclusion that we can at least maybe all agree on is that the picture is never black or white, and that there's a need to critically look at the relationship to see what are the benefits, what are the challenges, what are the perspectives. So I'm gonna let Radhika maybe make a quick comment, and then we'll open the floor for a few questions we're gonna take before to wrap up.
Thanks, Ameth. I just want to say something about the International Manifesto Group. As you know, this panel has been organized by the International Manifesto Group, and many of you already know quite a lot about it, but those of you who don't and who are interested, I just want to say very briefly that we have a group that has been going for, well, almost 2 years now, almost as long as the pandemic. And we have events like this, and we also engage in many other activities. And one of the things I'd like to draw your attention to is that we have a manifesto, which I hope you will all take a look at, consider reading, consider signing and sharing more broadly. And if you are interested, if you do read and find yourself in agreement, that you perhaps will join us, volunteer with us and help us put on events like this and organize other events. So as I say, please consider looking at that. I've just put the link in the chat. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Radhika. And as mentioned, the event today was co-organized by the Manifesto Group and the Toronto chapter of GRILA. For more information about GRILA, you can go to its website. It is grila.org. So a lot of points that were raised within by the presenters, going from a range of ideas regarding Western propaganda machinery that were raised by Daniel at the beginning, the question of militarization and the presence of AFRICOM, the question of infrastructure involvement of China in Africa. And Wang Chang also raised the question of the investment of China in terms of research, the cultural front, lots of examples that were given in different countries, the Chinese study programs, the think tanks, and the long-term collaboration between China, Communist Party, and some movement in the continent like the South African Communist Party. Abayomi, of course, looked very closely at FOCA, the Forum of China and Africa Relationship, the intervention, and also the migration crisis in Europe as being the result of the situation that was triggered by action of imperialism in countries like Libya, in Syria, etc. The question of regime change was also addressed by him, and he highlighted very quickly the continuity of the Joe Biden administration in the US in terms of giving the example of the conflict currently in Ethiopia and the Tigray region. He, of course, made this, highlighted the difference on vision of democracy between China and the Western powers, and insisted on that front at the situation of the indigenous population in North America, how they've been treated by this country, who so-called calling themselves democratic countries. And the last example he gave also is the state of the Black population in the US, victim of centuries of oppression and racial discrimination. Jan and Barry Sartman also came and talked about is China colonizing Africa? And the answer was no. And they articulated a different, several points relating to the definition of colonialism to try to show that China's involvement in Africa is not based on those characteristics of classical colonialism that we know of. They end up at the end talking about the behavior of China in Africa, the economic partnership, their vision of non-intervention, and also the lack of brain drain when it comes to the relationship between Africa and China, comparatively to what's happening between Africa in the West, where most of the human resources are living in the continent to go to the Western countries. Christine addressed the question of South-South cooperation versus neo-imperialism, and then try to bring a point about looking into the power relationship, that is the dynamics of power in terms of dealing between Africa and the rest of the world, China being one of them. And then she kind of looked at the question of some Chinese involvement in Africa, and also some good points that that relationship have brought to the table. So, and finally, Pablo just finished with the question of soft power. And then he made a very important point that the West cannot be the model against which to compare other countries in terms of the way they deal with Africa, because it's not a reference. So it's not enough to just go through the high-level numbers and figures of the relationship, but to break it down at a level that can be scrutinized to see what are the weaknesses, what are the benefits, what are the challenges, and what are the risk of such a relationship. So, as I mentioned at the end, the relationship is never a black or white situation. There are a lot of situations that are different from country to country. And but there are some constants, which is that Africa is looking for a process of industrialization, and then to break away from the long-term relationship between export of raw materials and also import of manufactured product. That is a fact, that is a reality that African countries no longer want to continue. The question of access to the land also is another question that is important for a lot of Africans. They're saying that the land is not for sale. Investors, whether they're coming from the West or from China, can have access to African land on the condition that needs to be defined by African countries based on their needs. The question of technology transfer also should be very much so taken care of in dealing with China, so that Africa can develop a self process of continuing and maintaining this infrastructure that have been invested in the African continent. Another point that a lot of people from Africa also are raising is the question of militarization. It is having a big impact on the continent. And so I just wanted to summarize it very high level like that. And we will take a few questions. It's been 2 hours already before to wrap up. I suggest that people can send their, I see Aziz raising his hand. Aziz, you have a question or comment you want to make?
I have a comment. I wonder if we have time, but anyway, thank you so much for this great event. I would just like to add to one of my esteemed colleagues and what Christine and Pablo have accurately expressed. Just make sure that delinking is a voluntary political movement and not the consequence of marginalization. So this is what China has historically done to reconnect later favorably in the global economy. And this is probably what Africa also must try to do collectively. On my reading, the proponents of capitalism want to impose a new Cold War, even a localized all-out war to halt the decline of capitalism, which now depends paradoxically on China's ability to reinvigorate capitalism. Here, Samira means warning to ensure that China retains patriotic control of its central bank and its banks, but also the outcome of the class struggle that threatens market socialism will be decisive. China's insatiable appetite for resources and Africa's need to build infrastructure must be seriously considered and all negative imbalances redressed. And I think what Pablo have said is very important. It is above all, and this is so important for us, the comprador nature of Africa's political regimes and its inability to unite that makes cooperation with China asymmetrical. In the AFRICOM Go Home film, it was showed how the scarecrow of China and the geopolitics of jihadist chaos allows imperialism to continue to maintain its grips on Africa. But I'm not sure that China still has a socialist South-South relation with Africa, but a state mixed capitalist-centered model, which is tempered with less profit than OECD's country and with some internationalist measures. China has now a military base in Africa and is following suit in the second generalized scramble over Africa, in which Africans are in a position of urgent resistance against generalized imperialism of the triad. And so far, the resistance response is pathetic. The defense of sovereignty through self-centered, reliant development and a rapid Pan-African integration are the only way to rebalance the asymmetry of the continent. And this is exactly why we asked for the support on struggles against impunity in the killing of Pan-Africans who fought to achieve that ongoing goal, like the campaign we have on Thomas Sankara. And I thank you so much for this great event and the deep insights. One of the peculiarities of this kind of exercise on China's Africa is the cruel absence of our Chinese comrades and activists among our audience. And we have to do a little more outreach with our comrades to balance our views. And this might be remedied for the next time, because this exercise needs to be done, I think, maybe a yearly exercise. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aziz, for your complimentary comments. Much appreciated. I will give the mic to Bikram Gill and then followed by Farid. So if you can please try to keep it short because of time constraint, that would be great.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to just a brief comment is that I think when assessing or approaching the China-Africa relation or this kind of framework, you know, one can look at individual events, like say, there's often reference to what happens in Zambia, right? So, but as far as I understand, the Zambia examples are often from, you know, some years ago, from which there has been clear demonstration of learning and disciplining that the Chinese state has provided evidence of in Africa, right? Like the example I gave in the chat of the disciplining of the firms in the DRC. We never see Western states do that. So just to say that China is clearly demonstrating a similarity without attending to how clearly there's been a learning process and a way in which African states have imposed conditions on China as well. Like, how does one explain the expelling of Chinese firms? But the point I really want to make is we need to go beyond looking at an example here, an example there, and look at it on a structural scale. And in my view, the biggest, let's say, opening that the China-Africa relation has posed is the challenge to Western finance capital, right? From 1980 to 2000, the recovery of the US economy from the crisis of the 1970s was in large measure built upon the extraction of interest payments from African states and elsewhere in the global South, right? There was a massive unproductive drain of wealth going from South to North, particularly centered on African states. We forget about the immense rates of return, and what changed that? What changed that was the arrival of Chinese investments in the 2000s, right? You see Malawi saying no to the World Bank. You see a series of states being able to enhance policy autonomy, which whatever the trade imbalances are, we now are in a period of a decade or two of productive investments. This is not interest leaving Africa. So there's no way in which anybody should be speaking a threat or a caution when now you have actual productive investments. We have things being built that can raise the manufacturing and productive base after 2 or 3 decades of an entire drain, right? And that is why the West is so afraid of China. It has threatened the hegemony of finance capital in the China-Africa relationship. So I just wanted to point that out, that should be always front and center as part of the conversation. Sorry, I'll stop there.
All right, thank you so much, Bikram Gill. Thanks for your comment also. So Farid, you're next. And you're on mute right now. Okay.
Okay, I'll be quickly brief on 2 questions on the issue of whether China is a colonial power. And forgive me if I'm repeating myself because I missed part of this discussion. China-Africa relations goes back since the Ming Dynasty in the 14th century, so it's not something new. There's archival and archaeological evidence to show that there was a contact, trade-related contact in Kenya, in Somaliland, President Somaliland, maybe elsewhere in Africa. And during the Ming Dynasty, Admiral Zheng He set out with 62 ships comprising of 70,000 people and 37,000 soldiers to protect the voyage. At that time, China was the largest economy in the world, and the purpose of the voyage was to open trade opportunities for China, so it was largely trade related. So it went across Asia, Middle East, and Africa. So China at that time, with that kind of level of voyage, such a powerful voyage, it had the ability to physically and militarily colonize large swaths of Africa, Asia, and Middle East. But it didn't do so because the voyage was primarily trade related. But that doesn't mean that in the current China-Africa relation, the relationship cannot be predatory or exploitative. There are concerns that the relationship is likely predatory if we look at the terms of the agreements, which have to change. For example, when African countries borrow from China, it is not state-to-state borrowing. The loans are borrowed against assets, public assets. In the case of the construction of the Kenya Standard Gauge Railway, the loans were borrowed against the Kenya Port Authority and the Kenya Railways. So in the case of default and the likelihood of a takeover physically or otherwise, it can be physical takeover of these assets or takeover of the revenues, control of the revenues of these assets, then Kenya has no power to stop it because these public assets had to waive sovereign immunity in the term established in the loans. So even Kenyan courts cannot intervene in that kind of situation. Also, the terms of the loans are not subject to public audit. The Kenyan Auditor General said that when the loans between Kenya and China were signed regarding the Standard Gauge Railway, he was not allowed to view the terms, which is wrong. So the funds and the loans are not subject to public audit. And lastly, if there is a dispute, there is no two-way dispute resolution. It's only controlled by China, and the sole body that is responsible for dispute resolution on China-Africa related trade and investment loans or investment is the China Economic and International Trade Arbitration. That's the only sole body that will be responsible for arbitration, which means if China decides to take over Kenyan ports, Mombasa port, or take over the revenues of the Mombasa port, the Kenyan courts cannot intervene because only one China-based dispute resolution and arbitration body is in control of that process. So it comes back to the point raised by Christine, that in order to scrutinize these types of this relationship and also the terms of the loans, we need to promote more intervention by civil society, Africa civil society groups, and also labor internationalism to scrutinize the nature of this relationship and also scrutinize the terms of the loans. It's my strong belief that these terms have to change because the way they are set up now, it is very detrimental to the African continent, and Africa completely has no leverage when it comes into these trade and investment relations. And lastly, I'm going to talk about industrial strategy. China-Africa relationship clearly lacks an industrial strategy. It's solely based on trade and investment. And there are examples, evidence that Africa is being deindustrialized. For example, in Ethiopia, Ethiopia has 10 massive industrial parks that were built by China. But these industrial parks are solely manned by Chinese and Western corporations. There are no African companies involved in any level of production in these industrial parks. And in fact, a lot of local enterprise are being driven out of business by these mammoth industrial parks that are dominated by Chinese and Western corporations.
Okay.
So that's
okay, good. Thank you very much. We'll take two more last questions. For two hands are up. Muzungu, Zayejo, and then we'll finish with Patricia because we're running out of time.
Good morning. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for the presentation, of course, and really having a constructive discussion with regards to China-Africa relations. My question is brief but to the point. I would like to ask first and foremost, what are China's strategic interests as it pertains to the Belt Road Initiative, and how can it prove to be beneficial for the African continent as a whole?
Thank you. And Patricia, you want to proceed, and then we get the two questions together?
Yeah, I was hoping that the Chinese guests were still on the panel to take questions. I heard that they left. Am I understanding that correctly?
I'm not sure if they're still here. But that's okay. You can still ask the question. Maybe someone else
Danny
can
and
jump in.
Hairong had to leave, but I think the others are here.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess my questions are to the Chinese guests. I guess in regards to mainly the the role that national humiliation plays in Chinese foreign policy, and how national humiliation in relation to foreign policy is treated by the Chinese government in its relation with African countries. That's it.
Thank you very much. And Pablo, Aziz, someone want to jump in, or whoever want to jump in for a final word to try to answer those two questions that are asked by Muzungu and Patricia. The Road and Belt initiatives, and also the last question from Patricia. Anyone can jump in just to wrap up those two questions into one?
Well, I can't. Hello. Yeah, I can't answer the latter one, obviously, but clearly the initiative is part of which, you know, Africa is only one component, and it goes back to really the idea that this initiative is broadly meant to bring into the ambit of, we can talk about Chinese influence, we can talk about Chinese strategic interest, or we can talk about their own tacit and explicit notion of reciprocity and the benefits for Africa as a whole. So we're really back to square one, which is about how we measure over time the benefits of this initiative. But strategically, clearly, it's part of a way of ensuring that China claims not to want to be a hegemon, but rather that it sees different parts of the world as being constituent partners in a process towards establishing itself as one of the premier sites of economic and political power. But, you know, I mean, if one were to take the fact that China does have strategic interests on the continent, that would obviously be linked to its economic and political outreaches, right? So really this debate that we're having, this discussion we're having is about that. I remain personally agnostic on this. I don't see China as an imperialist country, but that doesn't mean to say it doesn't have strategic interests within which different parts of the world have to, in some sense, play at some basic level a constituent, but an unequal role. I don't think one can talk about it in any other way. My own primary concern is it gets back to the question of Africa once not having a China policy, and I see that as a Pan-Africanist policy, like Aziz, whereas China having an Africa policy, right? And this gets back to my earlier issue around certain countries having more or less unequal relationships with China, where they can't, in fact, leverage power and authority in ways in which other countries can. South Africa being probably the one exception, and to a different extent in North Africa, of course, Egypt. But I think that initiative is part of it. It's part of a broader initiative. It's not just a one-off that relates to Africa, but is part of an overall strategy about China's place in the world that remains to be seen with respect to its power.
All right, thank you very much, Pablo, for bringing that up. And as you mentioned, there are some questions of strategic interests. Usually people are raising some concern about this relationship with the same way they are being very critical about the imperialist domination of Africa from the Western countries. And that is, in my sense, quite legitimate, but we have to look at this relationship as something dynamic, and then address some of the critical issues as we proceed, identify the advantages and also the weaknesses. But some of the blame also has to be put some time on the poor African leadership who have to be coming up with a strategic plan in terms of how they would like to deal with any other bloc in the world, whether it is China or India or Russia or the Western countries. It is up to the Africans to come up with a strategic vision that they can put on the table, and then know that in the long run, there is no chance of having a small country like Gambia with less than 2 million people going to negotiate on the equal footing with a country like China or India or European Union. So the process of building political unification and political power from the African bloc, including its diaspora, is key in terms of putting on the table the right question that needs to be addressed in terms of having a horizontal relationship between Africa and the rest of the world. So that's what I wanted to add by concluding that, as I mentioned earlier, the situation is never black or white. There's always a gray zone, and then I think that this debate will have to continue because we just touched up on some of the aspects of these questions. And then I'm John Riddell. If you want to add some final word, and I would like to thank in advance the Manifesto Group for giving us this opportunity to open the debate. As I say, it's the beginning of a discussion, but it's not an end. And John, you have the final word maybe to conclude.
Can I be heard?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I just want to second what Ameth said regarding the importance of this discussion, the many significant questions that have been posed and not fully answered, and this is good cause for us all to remain in contact and continue the discussion in future occasions of this type. And so with that, we thank you all for participating, for your patience with our technical difficulties, but we did pull it off, and it was certainly of great value, and I think all of us learned a great deal. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. And sorry if we didn't have the time to get to your questions. I think that we've got a couple of them, and then we wish you to have a good Sunday, and then the discussion will continue in an open-minded way, because this is an intellectual discussion to assess the relationship between Africa and China. The same way we do it with when we look at the relationship between Africa and Western Europe, we tend to be very critical sometimes on a lot of things, which is rightly so. So we have to continue that dialogue. And then I would like to take the final word to thank all the presenters for their good insight, their excellent feedback. And then we much appreciate their contribution, and we wish you to have a good day. Thank you very much and have a great day. Bye-bye.